Hello and welcome to Chapter 8 in our lecture series. This chapter is, I think, in spite of the looks of this guy here, I think you'll find out that he has some really good things to think about in terms of helping students. We're moving the needle certainly very far away from external influence, more towards building interdependence in a classroom, helping students in a classroom understand that they're all there and they have to learn how to get along. And so that's what this idea of building community, the Alfie Kohn, has put together. Let's look here at this cartoon I've put in the next slide. It says traditional discipline doesn't seem to be working. The whole business of I'm stronger than you are, so I can therefore beat you, which makes me right. What lesson does that teach? And so the question is, okay, well, that doesn't work. What does? Because in most of our counties, corporal punishment has been ruled out or is certainly on the way. And there are a few rural counties and smaller cities and stuff that talk about corporal punishment as a method. But for the most part, we're starting to ask ourselves, what does that teach other than I'm bigger than you, then I can beat you up. So that makes me right. So, and this cartoon I put in because it kind of expresses the point that it seems that our education department and our legislature is trying to legislate learning to happen, and just because you put it in the requirements doesn't mean that it's actually right for the child or age appropriate for the child. So we have to look at some of those things about that in terms of helping us to get along. I'd like for you to stop in just a moment, take pause, or certainly after you've listened to this lecture, read the scenario on page 140, and then let's see what we can talk about that. In fact, we'll talk about that in class. So our objectives, again, is to evaluate the use of external rewards as a way to control student behavior. Evaluating in terms of how does, the old Dr. Phil question is, how's that working for you? And look at between the different kinds of praises. Now, Alfie Kohn says that praise has to be in a certain format before it's productive. And there's a difference between productive praise and evaluative praise. So we'll talk about that. We'll look at student-teacher interaction. Once again, it's that mirror work. What's my relationship with the child? What's their relationship with me? And what are their relationships with each other? Because it's all part of learning how to get along in our society. So, and Alfie is also a proponent of involving the students in solving classroom problems. So we'll have something to talk about that. And then look how curriculum and things like that, procedures, contribute to or solve some of the problems in there. So his whole idea is that if you look at the bottom of the slide right here, it says the goal should be to teach the students the right thing to do. To teach the students the right thing to do. I don't know if the word students is kind of blocked out behind my face here, but that's the goal of what we're trying to do. He says that we have to look at student-teacher interactions, eliminate the use of rewards and praise. What? Eliminating the use of rewards and praise. And I think what he's saying is eliminate them as the primary motivation for a child's behavior in the class. Find alternatives to punishment and build classroom community. So we'll see what he means by those things. There may be, and we've talked about this a couple of times, and Kohn agrees that we should look with the curriculum. Are we moving too fast? Is it too difficult? Have we built it up incorrectly? Are we making sure we have all students, or as many as we possibly can with it in there? And then what he says in there is, ask yourself, what is it that we're supposed to be able to do? Now that's clearly defining your objectives, or targets as they're called now in many of the classroom lesson plans. So determine that. We're looking again at your words and your actions in here, learning to express anger appropriately. Now, there was some controversy in a previous chapter about whether we should be angry when we mete out a consequence. And I still agree, fully believe that we should not be angry. We should certainly not mete out a consequence when we've lost it. But Kohn says that you should be able to express anger appropriately. And we'll look at that. And then, of course, avoiding labels, criticism, and sarcasm. That probably sarcasm is one of my things. I use it mostly as humor, but sometimes some folks don't take it right, and it can be a hurtful thing. And that's one of the things that I've had to work on when I was teaching in elementary classes. Is some students' understanding of what some of the things I say may not be as sophisticated as I assume that might be. And we might have to look at that as well as criticism and labeling students. We do a good enough job as it is. So here's once again the proof. 70 studies show that extrinsic motivators, in other words, rewards and skills and things like that, are actually counterproductive. 70 studies, and probably a lot more than that since this was written. That praise only works for a short while, and that those praises and privileges and punishment can change the behavior but will not change the student. We have to change the student from within. They have to understand what they need to do in order to make that happen. Kohn says that rewards and praise will work for a while, but they lose their effectiveness. Just as if I said to you, good job. And then the next thing you did, I went, good job. Good job. Good. By the time I've said it 3 times exactly the same, you realize that it's really not as genuine as it was, as you thought it was the first time you heard it. So I think that is the mode that we also have to think about that, so that eventually these things lose their effectiveness. And I like the part at the bottom here. It says, much of the praise used by teachers is fundamentally fraudulent. We'll see what he means by that. So he says that effective praise, so there's a good kind of praise, doesn't praise the student. It does praise what they did. So it puts the student's focus and understanding on what I'm doing gets praised, not me. Because if I have the capacity to praise a student as themselves, then I also have the power to put that down. So we can't do that process. So we have to look at that and avoiding the phony praise, as I was just talking about a while ago. So look at, I think it's page 143 in your text, and that phrase that starts, the sentence that starts, only praise that places, and see what the rest of that says, and see how you feel about that. There's a chart at the top of 143 also. So, going back to the phrase now, we have to avoid praise that sets up competition by saying things like, John, your paper is the best paper in the class. Then somehow implies that everyone else's paper, which may be very close to just as good as John's, is somehow less. And that kind of praise is the kind of praise that we don't want to do. Now, you can say to John, John, this is the best work I've seen you do all year. That is strictly talking about what John has done this year. And it doesn't set up a competition, because I can turn right next to the student next to him and say, Gene, that's the best paper I've seen you do all year. And neither one of them feel bad for the other ones. So, and avoiding praising a student's characters. You know, just saying things to students that put them down is not the way to build a student's relationship with you, and certainly not a way to build a relationship with students among themselves, because it sets up this competition between each other too. Comparative and condescending type praise is what we want to avoid. That's what he says. Praise that will say, as I said before, yours is the best kind of praise that we've got, the best kind of praise. Yours is the best paper I've done of anybody else's in the class. Sets up a competition with the other ones that may not be healthy. So we have to look to finding alternatives to the punishment. Just as we are, sometimes I think there might be some people who might be guilty of driving exactly the speed limit unless there's not a policeman around. Because it's the same principle that works. This says that punishment works only as long as the punisher is around. But when he's not around, you may tend to violate that rule. And the same process works with our children in the classroom. So Kohn says that bad behavior is the kind of thing that you and the students need to help work that out together, so they understand why it is that you need them to behave a particular way. Not so much what it is that they did wrong, but what you need them to do right. Let's see. Students need to learn to think of the consequences of their actions have on others. So this is perspective taking, and we'll get into that in a moment. In building classroom community, he says it begins with a positive relationship with the students, using class meetings. He's also a proponent of using class meetings to solve problems. But these are problems that are pervasive class-wide. If you have something that only one student or 2 students do, you don't need a full class meeting in order to be able to solve that problem. So he's talking about class meetings for, say, things like, boys and girls, our room seems to be messy. The paper keeps getting left on the floor all the time. How is it that we can, and then go into a meeting about that and discuss how you can solve that problem, how everyone can have a part in making things better with that place. This business of children need to make as many choices as possible is one of those things of we have this choice or this choice or this choice, and let the student then decide and work into this mental process of evaluating which is the best thing for me to do. The idea of perspective taking is what you have heard very often with students. This business about allowing a student to something to happen. Let's say a pencil gets stolen, and you find out who did it. And then you say to that student, what if you came into class and someone had stolen your favorite toy car that you brought to class, and help them understand the perspective of how they make other people feel by their actions. And you can even tell the student how you feel by those actions. You can say, it makes me very sad when I see such and such and such and such, so that they understand that their actions have an effect on you too. Not to the point of the misbehavior where they feel some sort of power over you, but you can explain, it makes me feel sad for you because I know you can behave much better than this. But this is a process here that I'm not happy with. So helping students take perspective. He says that classroom rules should be avoided. Now here's his point of view. I'm not sure that all classroom rules need to be avoided, but it's the kind of things that when you have a hard and fast rule about something, it causes students to look for loopholes. The old story is W.C. Fields in his waning years was in bed. He was very ill and didn't have very long to live. And W.C. Fields is a well-known atheist, but they caught him in bed reading the Bible one day. And someone asked him, said, W.C. Fields, W.C., what are you doing? He says, looking for loopholes. And that's the whole point is when you make a hard and fast law, students will then look for loopholes. Well, you told me to get the books out, but you didn't say which book to get out. They'll go all lawyeristic on you. So that's what his perspective is about using rules, is meaning. And once again, it puts us in the cop role, where we have to be the enforcer, we have to be the punisher, and that's not helping a student when they're away from us and outside of the classroom. So let's look into that. And here's the downside of it. The strengths of it is it requires the teacher to look at what you're doing with your students, how your students interact with you, what you do with them. There's several points. He has 10 suggestions on page 149 in the textbook. So look at that scenario. It's on page 149. The downside of it says there are no suggestions of dealing with problem students. Once again, they didn't approach those students who just are not going to behave. That 5% that we've discussed earlier, or 10% in one philosopher's idea. That his ideas, again, may be too broad. But the point is that this is the bigger point here, that it says that this move to non-behavioral strategies, this carrot and stick business, moving away from that is hard for many teachers because teachers, just like some students, like to rely on, here's my rule, here's my consequence. However, it only works while the rules and the consequences and the enforcer is around. So you have to think about how is this going to affect these students in their future behavior, in their behavior outside of this classroom. Will they understand their relationship in terms of what is the right thing to do? Because that's where we're helping to move our students to do it, so that it's internally motivated behavior, where the students will do what they're supposed to do because it's the right thing to do. Not because there's a rule, not because there's someone who's watching them, but because they know this in the long run is the best thing for them to do in terms of behavior. So the weakness is it's hard for some teachers to come up with just that part in there. So let's look in here. Here's a quick quiz. Kohn calls praise that does not judge character but praises actions as and what, and see if you can remember that answer. We'll discuss these in class as you go through. Appreciative praise. Praise that appreciates what they do. I really like how neat you have tried to make your paper. That's really much improved over the papers that you've turned in the past. That praises the actions, not the person. Next question. Which of the 5 steps to creating a sense of community, this is on page 141, you can look in the text, creating a sense of community does the teacher control? You can hit pause and look and see if you can find these answers yourself, or you can look through here right now. In other words, all of the ones on page 141 are things that a teacher can control. Next one, helping students imagine the world around them from another person's point of view. Kohn calls what? Helping students to imagine the world around them from another person's point of view. Kohn calls, whoops, didn't mean to shake you there. Kohn calls perspective taking. I hope that you remembered that. Here's a quiz, here's a praise. John, your work is the best in the class. Now, is that evaluative praise or appreciative praise? Are we evaluating them or we are appreciating them? The answer is it's evaluative. Is this a good kind of praise? Kohn says it's not, because it sets up a competition that may be unhealthy. Next question. In your own words, what's the danger of evaluative praise? Think about these things. What are some of the problems that could be created? There's one. This is the part that surprised me. Kohn's point of view that often a student's self-critique is more negative than what you would say about them. Students, when they realize they've done wrong, are very often, especially if you allow a student to determine their own consequence, will actually give themselves a harder consequence than you would have given them before. And so we have to be careful about what a student does. Once again, we're asking students with less experience in life, less sense of what other things have done in their growing up years. They just haven't been around on this planet long enough to make some decisions. And they don't have the mental capacities in terms of their experience to be able to compute what is the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do in this process. So we have to be careful about how we're setting up evaluative praise. And there's the effect of others on class in here. If you are evaluating someone else, everyone else in the class then understands they can be evaluated too as a person. Not their work, them as a person. You know, your family is, and you've heard, well, maybe you're not. I have heard in many a faculty lounge, that whole family is a set of bad apples, or something to that effect, where those children, every child has come out of that household, has been bad apples, they've been disciplined, they've been suspended, blah, 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 and it starts to make up some sort of this almost an expectation of negative behavior, so that when it happens, it's almost validated. Aha, see, I told you that child couldn't behave right. So that there are certain signals that you send a student that cause them to go ahead and work that way. But you can break that cycle. 3 characteristics of effective praise. Kohn says, they praise the actions, not the students. They're specific as possible. They're genuine, not phony. None of this, good job, good job, good job, good job, because that goes away very quickly. Private when possible. This is the kind of praise where you lean over to a student and quietly say, I am so proud of the work that you've done. A little pat on the back, a sticker on a notebook page, something like that, that says, this is good work. That lets them know it's genuinely you are appreciating what they've done, is the kind of praise that makes a student just swell up with pride and want to work even harder for you. And praise that does not compare students. So-and-so is better than someone else. We've got competition enough in life to do that kind of thing without having it in the classroom where we're trying to teach students the right way to behave. Building classroom community begins with students having a what with teachers? Building classroom community, in other words, our interdependence, begins with students having what with the teachers and with other students? See if I can make this come up. Positive relationship, a good rapport. So that's the end of this chapter. I went through it fairly quickly, and I want you to go back and read that scenario that's at the beginning of the chapter, and there's one on page, I believe it was said 143. Go back and read through those scenarios in there and the points, and we'll discuss some of these things in class. If you have any questions about this or something you didn't understand, be sure to always just hit the pause button and write your question down so that you can bring it up in class. And I'll see you next time with Chapter 9. Bye.